Chapter 1. The afternoon was soft with the scent of wild honeysuckle, and a light breeze stirred the leaves of the old briar arch that shaded the garden path of Briarwood House. It was the sort of day that made one believe nothing truly wicked could happen, not in a place like Elcombe. And yet, as Miss Jane Marple would often say, wickedness had a most extraordinary way of hiding itself in the folds of civility. It was Mrs. Rosalind Eastgate's annual midsummer tea, a tradition upheld even after the death of her husband, the late Colonel Eastgate, some 12 years past. A tidy woman in her 60s, Rosalind prided herself on her social functions, though the guest list seemed to shrink a little each year, not for lack of invitations, but perhaps from the quiet discomfort she herself never noticed. This year's gathering featured the usual suspects of village respectability. There was Reverend Giles Holtham and his wife, Judith, seated stiffly beside the lilac bushes. Next to them, dotting her napkin delicately, sat Miss Inez Clearwater, spinster and music teacher, who blinked often and seemed never quite to finish her sentences. Captain Roland Bristow, long retired from any meaningful service, filled his plate with alarming confidence and hovered about Lady Frances Combermere, a sharp-tongued widow with a fondness for black-currant cordial and stories best whispered after the second glass. Miss Marple, who had not intended to attend this year, but had been drawn in by a gentle insistence from Rosalind, sat under the shade of a rose-covered arbour with a modest saucer of seed-cake, and a keen ear tuned toward the soft discord beneath the pleasantries. New face stirred the otherwise familiar gathering. Mr. Timothy Vale, a man in his early 40s, with a tan too fresh for England and shoes too clean for a gardener. He had moved into the gardener's cottage at Briarwood only 3 weeks prior, a botanical consultant. Rosalind had explained vaguely. No one quite knew what that meant. "You must try the blackberry cordial," Lady Frances was telling him now. "Rosalind has it made by that woman in Lower Lindley, the one with the limp and suspicious jam." Timothy Vale smiled politely, but sipped his tea instead. Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes moved, not nervously, no, but calculating. He watched the others far more than he participated, a quality she had long ago learned to associate with people who wore borrowed roles, even when their boots were polished. As the afternoon wove onward, a small drama unfolded near the hedgerow. Judith Holtham had stood rather abruptly, almost knocking her tea to the ground. She murmured something about needing to speak with Rosalind, but Rosalind was busy fussing with a jam tart that had crumbled on the plate. "I'm sure it's nothing," Miss Marple heard Judith say quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "But it's happened again. I found one in the vestry, pricked deliberately." Miss Clearwater's head jerked at that, but she said nothing. Captain Bristow's attention perked. "Pricked, you say? What sort of thing?" Judith flushed. "A note, left in a hymnal. Same words as last time." Before anyone could press further, Rosalind laughed too brightly and clapped her hands. "Oh, do come and try the lemon scones, everyone. I've had them sent from Bath." But Miss Marple had caught it. Not just the words Judith had said, but the quiet panic in her voice, the way her fingers trembled just enough to disturb her blouse's lace cuff. The gathering dispersed slowly as the sun began its descent behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the stone path. threading through the briar-covered arch like fingers curling around a secret. Miss Marple lingered last, brushing cake crumbs from her lap with deliberate slowness. "Rosalind," she said gently as her hostess poured another cup, "that gardener of yours, Mr. Vale, he doesn't quite seem the gardening sort." Rosalind blinked. "Oh, doesn't he? I think he's quite good with my rose beds. And handsome, too, in that brooding sort of way." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, touching the edge of her teacup. "And your briars are blooming nicely." Rosalind smiled, pleased. "Aren't they? Timothy said something about pruning them in the moonlight. Old folklore, but he swears by it." Miss Marple's eyes lingered a moment on the arch above them, its thorns curling sharply amid pale blossoms. "Moonlight and thorns," she said softly. "It does sound like the beginning of something unfortunate." "Before moving next, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you crave more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp." Chapter 2. Sunday morning cast a sleepy golden haze over the village of Elcombe, warming the cobblestones and brightening the stained glass windows of St. Athelstan's. The church bell rang just once. Reverend Holtham had always preferred a single, stately toll rather than the clanging enthusiasm of other parishes. Miss Marple arrived early, as she often did, finding comfort in the quiet rustling of pages, the faint smell of polish on the pews, and the way sunlight caught the dust in drifting halos. She settled into her usual spot, 3 rows from the front, unobtrusively near the pulpit, but with a clear view of the congregation. Judith Holtham was already seated in the front pew, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her usual Sunday composure had dimmed. She glanced behind her twice before the sermon began, and once startled at the sound of the door opening. Rosalind Eastgate arrived a few minutes late, unusual for her, and waved gently at Miss Clearwater, who responded with a vague, distracted nod. The village music teacher looked unusually pale, and as the organ wheezed into the first hymn, she seemed to fumble with the page numbers. Timothy Vale was not present, Miss Marple noticed. She always noticed absences more than presences, especially when those absences came after a polite introduction and a pair of eyes too careful in their observation. After the service, the crowd thinned into their usual Sunday murmurs. Reverend Holtham shook hands stiffly at the exit, while Judith remained inside, lingering by the side aisle that led to the vestry. Miss Marple waited, pretending to adjust her gloves, then slowly followed the curve of the aisle. She made a quiet point of examining the fresh floral arrangement on the altar. Wildflowers, nicely balanced, Miss Marple. Judith's voice came softly, just above a whisper. The elderly lady turned, giving her a kind, reassuring look. "My dear, you seemed rather troubled yesterday. Something about a note in the hymnal?" Judith hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her coat and produced a folded slip of paper. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from drama, but restraint. This was left in Hymn Book 143, tucked inside, just like the last one. There was another 6 months ago, though I never said anything. I hoped it was a child's prank. Miss Marple took the paper gently and read. "She walks beneath the thorned briar. Soon, so shall you." There was no signature. The handwriting was small, deliberate and oddly rhythmic. Miss Marple handed it back. "Who else knows about this?" "No one," Judith replied, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Only me. I didn't even tell Giles. I didn't want— well, you know how he is. He'd think it nonsense." "Perhaps it is," Miss Marple said mildly. "But even nonsense often has an author. And intent." Judith's breath hitched. "There's something else. Inez Clearwater. I saw her looking through the hymnals before anyone arrived. She seemed frantic." Miss Marple nodded, but said nothing more. Outside, the village green shimmered with the scent of cut grass and the lazy hum of bees. A few children chased one another between the apple trees, and Lady Frances Combermere, standing outside the bakery with a paper bag of Bath buns, raised her eyebrows at the pair emerging from the church. "Odd thing," she called across the lane, "isn't it? Rosalind's gardener off to Bath this morning, on a Sunday. What sort of man tends roses in the city?" Judith blinked. "Went to Bath?" Lady Frances shrugged. "That's what Rosalind said, loud enough for anyone to hear. Off in a hurry, suitcase in hand. But if you ask me, she seemed more flustered than usual. Dropped her glove twice on the pavement." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Well, some trips are urgent, though the roses might disagree." The two women parted then, Judith toward the vicarage, and Miss Marple down the narrow path that led past the general store and into the quieter part of the village. She did not go home. Instead, she took a gentle detour through the churchyard, where briars grew low against the stone wall, and paused at the southern boundary, where the thorns climbed unusually high. Beneath the thickest cluster, something gleamed. Not much, just a faint glint, like sunlight striking porcelain. Miss Marple crouched slowly and reached beneath the foliage, careful of the barbs. It was a cup fragment, the base of a teacup, cracked clean through the middle. Pale green porcelain with a gold edge. Distinctly not the sort Rosalind Eastgate kept in her cabinets, which Miss Marple had noted many times over the years. She tucked it into her pocket, brushing a thorn from her sleeve. Behind her, somewhere near the back fence of the churchyard, a twig snapped. Miss Marple turned, but there was no one in sight. Only the wind, perhaps, or someone who'd already learned the value of staying just out of sight. Chapter 3. The following morning brought rain, a thin, persistent drizzle that softened the landscape and muffled sound. From her parlour window, Miss Marple watched the village street grow slick with moisture, carriages trailing ribbons of mud behind them. In the distance, smoke curled from Briarwood's chimney, but the garden beyond the thorned arch remained undisturbed. No sign of Timothy Vale had returned. She sat with her knitting in her lap, though she hadn't touched a needle since breakfast. Her mind circled the details, the note in the hymnal, Vale's sudden absence, Rosalind's unease, and the curious shard of porcelain hidden beneath. The briars, so cleanly broken, it seemed placed, not discarded. By mid-morning, the rain eased, and Miss Marple fetched her umbrella and set off toward the grocer's, which conveniently passed near Briarwood's south gate. As she neared the bend, the gate stood ajar, the latch half-hooked. She slowed, her gaze catching on a glove wedged into the iron scrollwork. A woman's, ivory-coloured, embroidered delicately along the wrist. Damp and speckled with soil, it looked carelessly lost, yet its position in the latch seemed intentional, as if caught mid-decision. Miss Marple plucked it free and turned it over, the initials stitched inside, F.C. Lady Frances Combermere. She was not the sort of woman to lose anything without immediately retrieving it or announcing its loss. Miss Marple let herself into the garden with practised politeness. The front path was deserted, and through the drawing-room window the silhouette of Rosalind Eastgate moved between bookshelves distractedly. Miss Marple rang the bell once, then waited. The door opened a moment later, not by Rosalind, but by one of the new maids, a timid girl with a blotchy apron and eyes that darted sideways. "I'm terribly sorry, miss, but Mrs. Eastgate's not receiving visitors just now," she said with a slight quiver. "Oh dear," Miss Marple replied, unfazed. "I only wanted to return something she may have misplaced." She held out the glove. The maid blinked. "That isn't hers." "No," Miss Marple agreed, watching her. "It's Lady Frances Combermere's. Curious place for it to turn up, wouldn't you say?" The girl hesitated, her fingers wringing the edge of her apron. "She was here early, before breakfast, said it was urgent. Mrs. Eastgate hadn't come down yet, so she walked through the garden. I didn't think to." "You did nothing wrong, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "though you might want to mention it to Mrs. Eastgate before someone else does." She thanked the girl, tucked the glove into her bag, and left the house with slow, thoughtful steps. At the corner near the vicarage, she ran into Reverend Holtham, umbrella tilted, carrying a parcel of devotional books under one arm. He looked more tired than usual. "Miss Marple," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "do forgive my wife. Judith's nerves have been a bit strained of late." Miss Marple adjusted the strap of her handbag. "Church duties can be trying, especially when strange things appear in hymnals." The vicar stopped just enough to be telling. "She told you. She confided in me, yes. A wise decision, I think. Has anything else gone missing recently?" Holtham blinked. "Missing? Or perhaps moved? A letter, perhaps? Or a key?" He gave a small, startled laugh. "A communion key vanished last week. Turned up again the next day in the lost property basket. I assumed someone misplaced it." Miss Marple nodded, but didn't press further. Instead, she asked, "Did Mr. Vale attend church last week?" "No," Holtham replied, frowning slightly. "Now that you mention it, I don't believe he's been to a single service. Not that it's required, of course, but curious in a village like this." Miss Marple smiled politely. Curiosity has a strange habit of becoming important in hindsight. They parted, and as she continued along the lane, a different thread pulled at her attention. The unmistakable scent of lavender soap. It lingered faintly outside the post office, where Lady Frances Combermere stood, with a tightly folded newspaper under one arm, and a crumpled telegram in hand. "Miss Marple," she greeted crisply. "Running errands, are we?" "As we all must," Miss Marple replied. Her gaze flicked to the telegram. Bad news. Lady Frances tucked it away, a little too quickly. "Family matter. My cousin in Surrey. Always something dreadful with her housemaids. Honestly, I don't know why. She insists on keeping so many." Miss Marple didn't ask further. Instead, she retrieved the glove from her bag and held it up. "I believe this may be yours." Lady Frances blinked. "Heavens, yes! I must have dropped it yesterday." She reached for it, but Miss Marple held it just a moment longer. "You were at Briarwood this morning," she said softly. "Before breakfast?" The woman's lips thinned. "Yes. I had a matter to discuss with Rosalind, private and entirely unrelated to this unpleasant business of notes and hymnals, I assure you." Miss Marple returned the glove and smiled. "I didn't say it was." Lady Frances gave a curt nod and walked off down the lane, her heels clicking sharply against the wet stone. That evening, as the sky cleared and the sun cast long amber streaks across the rooftops, Miss Marple sat by her window again. The glove, the vestry note, the porcelain shard, and Timothy Vale's convenient departure. They had not yet formed a full pattern, but they were no longer pieces of separate puzzles, and she had a feeling, faint, like the distant tremor of a string pulled taut, that whatever had begun under the thorned briar was far from over. Chapter 4. Rain returned the next morning, not in the soft drizzle of the day before, but with a steadier rhythm, an unrelenting patter on the rooftops of Elcombe that made even the chimneys seem to hunch against the grey. Miss Marple had just set her breakfast tray aside when a knock came at her door, hurried, uncertain. It was Inez Clearwater. She stood soaked beneath her wide-brimmed hat, raindrops sliding from the brim like tears she hadn't the composure to shed. Her gloves were mismatched, one damp with mud. "I'm so sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple," she began, voice trembling at the edges, "but something's happened. Again." Miss Marple ushered her in at once, guiding her to the fireside, and offering a towel without fanfare. Once seated, Inez retrieved a paper from her handbag. Creased, still damp, the ink blurred slightly where the fold had caught moisture. Another note. "She sings to herself, though no one hears. But the thorns are listening. Her song will end beneath them." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the side table. "Where did you find this?" "In my piano bench," Inez whispered. "This morning. I never lock it. It's just a habit. But it was tucked between my songbooks. I nearly missed it." Miss Marple studied the woman more closely now. Inez Clearwater had always been a fragile sort, prone to tremors of the heart rather than acts of certainty. But this morning something in her expression had shifted. There was fear, yes, but something else. A kind of quiet resolve struggling to take root. "Inez," Miss Marple said gently, "has anyone been in your house recently? Anyone unexpected?" Inez hesitated. "Lady Frances stopped by 2 evenings ago. She wanted to discuss a musical program for the Harvest Fete. We didn't speak long. She seemed distracted." "And did you show her to the piano?" "No. We stayed in the sitting room. She never asked to see it." Miss Marple filed this away. "Has Rosalind Eastgate spoken to you lately?" The question landed heavier than expected. Inez shifted in her chair. "She asked me something strange last week, about Judith Holtham's childhood, whether I'd taught her music back then. I hadn't. I never taught Judith." "Did she explain why she asked?" "No, only smiled. That brittle kind of smile Rosalind has when she's hiding something." Miss Marple gave a soft nod. "Thank you, my dear. It's good of you to bring this to me." Inez paused before leaving. "Do you think it means something? The thorns again?" "I do," Miss Marple said simply. "And someone very much wants us to think the worst of them." Once Inez had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly by the hearth. The repeated motif of thorns, cryptic but consistent, tied the notes together like a refrain, and always directed toward women. Judith, now Inez, both linked to the church, both present at Rosalind's tea. And then there was Lady Frances, wandering gardens before breakfast and dropping gloves near half-latched gates. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village lending library, a quiet stop on the edge of the square. The librarian, Miss Enid Swale, wore her usual thick cardigan despite the damp, and nodded politely as Miss Marple browsed the return shelf. It was not books she had come for, but conversation. "Terrible weather for rose pruning," Miss Marple said mildly. Enid gave a dry chuckle. "Rosalind's man hasn't been seen in 2 days. Off to Bath, I heard. Strange sort him. Did he ever come in here?" "Twice. Took out a book on medicinal plants and another on Victorian poisons. Said he was writing an article for a gardening journal." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And did he return them?" Enid gestured to the return pile. "Just came back this morning." The poison one still had pressed leaves between the pages, pennyroyal and monkshood. Miss Marple opened the book and turned a few pages. Sure enough, the leaves were there, carefully flattened, still fragrant. A man who studied poisons with that much care likely wasn't reading for leisure. "Has anyone else shown interest in these books?" she asked. Lady Frances asked about one. Enid replied thoughtfully. Said she wanted to research a plant she'd seen in Rosalind's garden. Something with blue petals. She left empty-handed. Miss Marple thanked her, then slipped the page with the monkshood leaves into her handbag before heading out into the rain. At home, she made a note to speak with Judith Holtham again. Alone this time. The notes, the plants, the disappearances, they were not random. They were ripples in the same pond made by a single careful stone. She was still pondering this when a knock came at her door again, firmer this time. It was the vicar. "Pshaibu, Marple," Reverend Holtham said grimly. "I fear there's been a break-in at the church." "Something taken?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, something added. A doll, placed in the pulpit, handmade, stuffed with dried thorns, and a note pinned to its chest." She followed him back to the church, a coat drawn tight. The doors stood open, the pews empty and darkened by the gloom. And there, under the pulpit lamp, sat the crude doll. Twisted burlap limbs, red thread for a mouth, and burlap limbs, red thread for a mouth, and thorns bursting from its sides pinned to it. She thinks she sees, but the Briar sees more. Miss Marple did not shudder. She only stared. Some mysteries whispered. This one was beginning to sing. Chapter 5. By early evening, news of the doll in the pulpit had spread through Elcombe like a crack through porcelain. Quiet, swift, and impossible to ignore. Mrs. Pettingill from the bakery whispered it to 3 customers before the bell above the door stopped ringing. Mr. Copeland, the apothecary, muttered about pagan nonsense to anyone who came in for cough syrup, and by dusk even the most sceptical villagers walked with quicker steps past the church, avoiding the windows as if something inside might be watching back. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She had stayed long enough to examine the doll once more, noting the uneven stitching, the faint scent of lavender clinging to the burlap, and the fine copper pin that held the note. Not A common household pin. Something older, ornamental. A brooch back, perhaps, repurposed. She said little to the vicar, only that it would be wise not to remove the doll just yet. The person who placed it there may wish to see its effect, she said. Best not to disrupt the performance too soon. That night, Miss Marple reviewed her notes in silence, seated by the oil lamp, with her tea growing cold beside her. A sequence had begun. First the notes, then the glove, the broken teacup, the garden gate. Now a voodoo-like doll. The presence of thorns in each clue was deliberate, almost ritualistic. And still, no death. It was rare, in Miss Marple's experience, for someone to go to such elaborate trouble without crossing that final, dreadful line. But this case, this felt different, personal, measured, as if the killer were biding time. The next morning, Rosalind Eastgate came calling. She arrived at 9:30, unannounced and visibly agitated. Her hair was pulled back tighter than usual, and her voice lacked its usual crispness. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, though her foot was already inside the threshold. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "I was just making a fresh pot." They sat in the drawing-room, the air between them filled with the faint scent of bergamot, and a silence Rosalind seemed reluctant to break. "It's all this business with the church," she said at last. "Very unpleasant, very unnecessary." "Unpleasant, yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Unnecessary? I'm not so sure. Someone believes it serves a purpose." Rosalind gave a sharp sniff. "Nonsense. It's theatrics. Someone playing games." "And yet," Miss Marple said mildly, "the game seems directed quite specifically." Rosalind narrowed her eyes. "Directed at me, you mean?" "I said no such thing. Though Lady Frances's early visit to your garden seemed rather urgent." Rosalind stiffened. "Frances came to warn me. She believes someone is trying to frighten the women in the village. Divide us, perhaps. Inez, Judith, myself, and now her." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the rim of her teacup. "Do you believe her?" A pause. "I believe Frances knows how to stir a pot," Rosalind said curtly, "and that she resents my authority in this village more than she'd admit." Miss Marple gave a small nod, her thoughts drifting. "I assume you've heard about Timothy Vale?" Rosalind added. "Only that he left for Bath rather suddenly." Rosalind's lips tightened. "He left a note. Said his contract had been terminated elsewhere, and he'd taken a new post. I didn't question it at the time." "But you do now?" "I don't know what to believe, Miss Marple. That's the problem. Everyone's whispering. There's something rotten beneath all this politeness." She rose abruptly. "I'll let you get back to your morning. I only came because, well, you seem the only one not caught in the hysteria." Miss Marple saw her to the door, watching as she vanished briskly down the lane, her silhouette stark against the grey sky. By mid-afternoon, the village had become quieter still. Doors closed earlier, blinds drawn slightly. Even the children kept closer to their mothers. Miss Marple walked to the vicarage just before tea. Judith Holtham answered, eyes red-rimmed but calm. "I rather expected you." They sat in the conservatory, Judith pouring tea with slow, measured movements. "Something's changed, hasn't it?" Miss Marple asked gently. Judith nodded. "Frances came to see me. She told me to leave Elcombe. Said the village had become unsafe for women like me." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "Women like you?" Judith hesitated. "Quiet, independent, unsupervised. She's always had a flair for drama. She said someone was watching me, that if I didn't leave now, I might be the next Bramble bride." Miss Marple's spoon paused mid-stir. "She used that phrase?" "Yes." That night Miss Marple wrote it down on her notepad, underlining it twice. Bramble bride. It wasn't a phrase one invented lightly, and it had the ring of something old, something local. Possibly folklore, possibly more. The next day she asked Enid Swale at the library about it. "Bramble bride," Enid repeated, frowning. "It's old folklore, not from Elcombe specifically, more common in the moor villages. It referred to a woman who died among the thorns, either sacrificed or punished. Usually someone the community had turned on." "Did it carry a warning?" "Yes, that those who betrayed the truth would be claimed by the Briar." "Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because someone in Elcombe is making sure we remember." And someone she feared was planning to turn the story into reality. Chapter 6. The morning after her visit to the library, Miss Marple walked the long way to the post office, skirting through the churchyard path behind St. Athelstan's. The briars along the wall glistened with dew, their thorns sharp and stubborn beneath the sun's weak gleam. They looked older than the stones they clung to, wild, rooted, and patient. She paused briefly at the archway, as if expecting something. Movement, a whisper, the echo of another note. But nothing greeted her but the rustle of sparrows in the ivy. At the post office she found Lady Frances Combermere already inside, speaking in hushed tones to Miss Grafton behind the counter. The tone was urgent, but the content indistinct. As Miss Marple entered, Lady Frances turned with the crisp smile of a woman caught mid-conversation she'd rather not explain. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said lightly. "Sending a parcel?" "No," Miss Marple replied with equal pleasantness. "Just observing the state of things." Lady Frances adjusted her scarf. "I hope you're not indulging the village's panic. Honestly, if I hear one more whisper about cursed dolls or phantom gardeners—" "Bramble brides," Miss Marple said softly. The name struck. Just briefly, but enough to cause a flicker behind the eyes. Lady Frances recovered quickly. "Old nonsense," she said. "A tale to scare milkmaids. Though it's amusing how quickly old superstitions find their way into respectable mouths when fear's in fashion." "And yet," Miss Marple replied, "you seem remarkably interested in the people most affected." Lady Frances gave her a long, careful look. "You're suggesting something." "I rarely suggest," Miss Marple said, taking a pamphlet from the notice board. "I only listen, and very few people in this village do that properly." She left Lady Frances frowning behind her, and made her way down the lane to Briarwood House. Not for a confrontation, but for tea. Rosalind Eastgate had agreed, albeit reluctantly, when Miss Marple had suggested it the evening before. She'd sounded tired on the phone. Afraid. The drawing-room was darker than usual when Miss Marple entered, despite the sun outside. Heavy curtains drawn, a fire laid but unlit. "I'm afraid I've a headache," Rosalind said by way of greeting. "The village is becoming unbearable." Miss Marple accepted her tea and took a quiet look around the room. Something was different, less arranged. The tidy rows of framed photographs on the sideboard were crooked, one of them face down. "Something missing?" she asked casually. Rosalind flinched. "No, nothing. I dropped a cup yesterday, careless." "I thought I saw a photo of your husband here once," Miss Marple said. Rosalind's gaze sharpened. "Yes, I moved it. It doesn't bring me peace these days." Miss Marple nodded. "Understandable. Do you keep mementos of him?" "A few. Why?" "I was curious," Miss Marple said lightly, sipping her tea. "I often find that scrapbooks tell a better story of a marriage than words ever do." That struck a nerve. Rosalind stood abruptly. "I should find the aspirin." She vanished down the corridor, and Miss Marple stood quietly, setting her teacup aside. Her gaze swept the bookshelf, orderly, mostly gardening manuals and society histories, but one volume on the far right caught her eye, leather-bound, thick. She stepped closer and gently eased it free. A scrapbook. The pages inside were arranged with care. Clippings, dried flowers, invitations, photos. A pressed rose from their engagement. A menu from a dinner in Bath. A note scribbled in the Colonel's hand, clipped to a receipt for arsenic, dated 1937. Miss Marple did not take it with her. She closed the book and replaced it, precisely as it had been. When Rosalind returned, Miss Marple was seated again, hands folded, expression mild. "Aspirin helps, but only so much," Rosalind muttered, rubbing her temple. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you for the tea." And Rosalind, grief has a way of twisting into something else if one keeps it too long, even in scrapbooks. Rosalind didn't reply. That afternoon, back in her cottage, Miss Marple received an unexpected visit from Inez Clearwater. She arrived with something wrapped in a silk handkerchief. "I found this in my piano again," she said, voice tight. "Not a note, a key, with a tag." Miss Marple unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a brass key, old but clean, with a small, aged paper tag. "E.B. Elcombe Bank?" Miss Marple asked. Inez shook her head. "No, I think it's his." "Whose?" "Colonel Eastgate. His name was Edwin Bartholomew Eastgate. Rosalind told me once, long ago, when we were both a bit drunk on wine after a fete." Miss Marple turned the key in her hand. "Have you told anyone else?" "No." "But Inez, something is happening here, isn't it? Something terrible." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and I think it began long before any of us noticed." As Inez left, the light dimmed behind the clouds again. The thorns along Miss Marple's garden fence danced slightly in the breeze, and for the first time she felt it. A timeline forming, a rhythm to the clues. But one piece was still missing. Not the why, the when. Something was coming. And the village, for all its murmuring and mistrust, had not yet realized that the worst was not the storm of gossip, but the calm that came just before a blow was struck. Chapter 7. A cold wind swept through Elcombe the next morning, chasing the last of the autumn leaves across the cobbled lanes, and rattling the signposts with a hollow clink. There was a new stillness to the village, less of peace and more of held breath. Miss Marple noted the quiet with the same attention she gave to a poorly told alibi. She spent the early part of the day composing a letter to her nephew Raymond, not for the sake of news, but because the act of writing helped her arrange her thoughts. A methodical mind, after all, often required ink and paper as much as tea and silence. By noon, she set out again, this time to the vicarage. Judith Holtham met her in the front garden, pruning back the frost-bitten hydrangeas with more force than was strictly necessary. "I keep expecting someone to tell me it's all been a joke," Judith said without looking up, "that the doll was some child's prank, that the notes were never real, that I only imagined Frances threatening me." Miss Marple watched the pile of withered blooms growing at Judith's feet. "And yet," she said, "you don't truly believe that?" "No," Judith admitted, lowering her shears. "No, I don't." They went inside, where the vicar had left for a meeting in Lower Bramley, and the house had the comfortably worn hush of too many sermons. Judith poured tea with steady hands this time. "I've remembered something," she said after a long moment. "Years ago, when the Colonel was still alive, Rosalind had a room above the garden side of the house. She called it the East Parlour, though no one ever went in there. It was always locked." "Always?" Miss Marple asked gently. Judith nodded. "I went round there once with flowers. There was no answer at the front, so I walked round back. The door to that room was open. Rosalind was inside, alone, just staring at the wall. She didn't see me. I left before she noticed." "Dear." Marple tilted her head. "What was on the wall?" "I don't know. A tapestry, I think. Something floral. But it wasn't the look of the room that stayed with me. It was her face. She looked lost, like she didn't belong in her own home." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, "Do you know if she ever reopened that room?" "I don't. I doubt anyone does. But I remember Timothy Vale was often near that side of the house, always with some excuse." Miss Marple left shortly after, her thoughts now circling tighter around that side of the garden. A room once locked, a room now potentially seen by someone with new eyes, someone who vanished shortly after. She made her way next to the general store, where Captain Roland Bristow was browsing tins with theatrical scorn. "Nothing in this shop's sealed properly," he muttered, holding up a can of treacle. "Everything's been tampered with." "Surely not everything," Miss Marple said with a polite smile. He grunted. "This village has a habit of spoiling its own peace. One minute it's jam and wool and Sunday school. Next thing you know, there's a doll in the pulpit and women hiding behind curtains." Miss Marple selected a tin of tea and placed it in her basket. "You were quite close to the Colonel, were you not?" Bristow looked up sharply. "We served together once. He had backbone, I'll give him that." "Did he have enemies?" The captain hesitated. He had opinions, mostly about Rosalind. Said she married him for respectability, and then punished him for being dull. "Did he ever mention a key? Something important he kept aside?" "Kept a spare safe key in his boot," Bristow said dryly. "Claimed it was the one place she'd never look." Miss Marple left the shop soon after, passing by the north wall of Briarwood on her way home. She paused at the Briar arch again. A faint sound, a whisper, a sigh. No, just the breeze, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else, something floral. Not roses, not lavender, monkshood. She recognized it now, faint and sharp as burned almonds. She didn't linger. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a single line in her notebook. The key belongs to the past, but someone has used it in the present. The next day, Elcombe awoke to find Inez Clearwater missing. She had not answered her bell lesson in Lower Linley. Her piano stool remained cold back, her music open to evening waltz. The curtains were drawn, the kettle still warm, and her back door unlocked. Chapter 8. Elcombe had always been a village that resisted drama. It tolerated gossip, relished scandal in whispers, but anything louder than a raised voice at the grocer's was considered indecent. But by the afternoon of Inez Clearwater's disappearance, Elcombe was no longer resisting. It was buzzing. The constable from Lower Bramley had been summoned, and though he did his best to maintain order, the sheer number of villagers hovering just beyond Inez's gate made discretion impossible. A lace handkerchief was found caught on her garden trellis. The piano bench remained pulled back, her gloves resting neatly beside the sheet music. But no Inez. Miss Marple arrived without fanfare, slipping through the rear lane and approaching the constable quietly. "Have you searched the property thoroughly?" Nodded, clearly flustered. "Twice. No signs of forced entry. Her back door wasn't latched. No tracks in the soil, though. It rained overnight. And the attic?" The constable blinked. "Didn't think to check that." "Best to," Miss Marple said. "People often forget what they leave above them." He took her seriously, and within 10 minutes the attic was searched. Dust, a trunk of old sheet music, moth-nibbled concert dresses. No Inez. Miss Marple did not linger. She knew what she needed to know. She walked next to the vicarage, where Judith Holtham was waiting on the steps, her arms folded tightly against herself. "I heard," she said before Miss Marple could speak. "Jason didn't leave voluntarily," Miss Marple replied. Judith's face drained of colour. "Then someone took her." Miss Marple gave no answer. "You said Rosalind had a locked room. I believe it is now unlocked." Judith stared. "You think she's keeping Inez in that room?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone wants us to remember the feeling of a story too old to check and too frightening to ignore." Judith stepped back. "Are we in danger?" Miss Marple didn't flinch. "Not all of us, but someone is." She left her then and walked with deliberate calm to Briarwood. The sky was a pale grey, due to a briar arch still wet from the earlier mist. Miss Marple noted that the broken teacup shard she had discovered days ago, left tucked under the thorn bush, was gone. She did not ring the bell this time. She went to the side of the house, where the east parlour window overlooked the garden. The curtains were drawn, but light filtered through faintly. The back door was unlocked. Inside, the house was too quiet. The ticking of a grandfather clock seemed louder than any footstep. Miss Marple moved with care, bypassing the front rooms, walking along the corridor lined with portraits, none of which looked directly forward. She paused at a faded door near the end. It was slightly ajar. The east parlour. She pushed it open, gently. The room smelled of dust and old perfume. A single window let in the grey light. At the centre, beneath a sheet-covered armchair, stood a narrow table lined with books, small glass bottles, and something covered in dark velvet. She stepped closer. It was a music box carved old, a small brass key still in its side. She turned it once. The tune that played was faint, familiar. Evening Waltz, her breath caught. Beside it, a handkerchief, monogrammed Oasis, and then, barely audible, movement above. The ceiling groaned. Floorboards flexed. Miss Marple turned sharply. She stepped back into the hallway and followed the sound, up the narrow staircase that led to the attic above the east wing. This attic, unlike the one in Inez's home, was not filled with dresses or dust. This one was warm. The scent of lavender soap lingered, and faintly, music. She found her there. Inez Clearwater, wrapped in a shawl, seated on a small cot, with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were dry, but her voice was raw. He said it would be safe here, just for a night, until he came back. Who said that, dear? Miss Marple asked, already certain of the answer. Timothy. He told me they were watching me. He said I wasn't safe, that the others, Rosalind, Francis, would try to silence me. And why would he think that? Inez's lips parted, but the words failed her. Miss Marple didn't press further. Come with me. They descended slowly. The threshold of the east parlour. Inez paused. I didn't know, she whispered, about the room, about the scrapbook. He said it was Rosalind's secret, proof of something terrible. He said he would show it to me. Miss Marple gently guided her out into the hall. And did he? No, Inez said. But I think someone else did. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and prepared a pot of chamomile tea. The day had not brought resolution, but it had brought a turning point. Timothy Vale was no longer simply absent. He was the author of something, and someone else had picked up his pen. Miss Marple opened her notebook again and underlined a single name. Lady Frances Combermere. She had used the term Bramble Bride. She had visited every woman threatened. She had warned them, not protected them. Warnings were often meant for the warned, but sometimes they were warnings to others about who was doing the watching. Chapter 9. The next morning brought frost sharp enough to silver the hedgerows and freeze the well basin near the church. The village walked quieter that day, as if afraid to break the thin ice holding everything together. Inez Clearwater was safe. That news, when it came, soothed some and puzzled others. She had not been harmed nor held by force, and the constable, more eager to resolve matters than understand them, declared it a misunderstanding. Miss Marple, however, knew better. Inez had not vanished by mistake. She had been moved, quietly, persuasively, by someone who understood fear well enough to wear it like a cloak. After settling Inez safely at the vicarage under Judith's care, Miss Marple turned her attention to the next unanswered question. Why? Why Inez? Why the notes, the doll, the carefully chosen quotes about thorns and silence? Why the music box in the east parlour? She returned to Briarwood with a reason, an invented one, but not a lie. Rosalind answered the door herself this time. Shoulders squared, complexion pale and slightly drawn. "I'm afraid I can't offer you tea," she said curtly. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple said. "I only wanted to ask you about Frances Combermere." Rosalind raised an eyebrow. "Frances? What of her?" "You've known her the longest, haven't you?" Rosalind's tone turned brittle. Longer than I'd prefer. We were debutantes in the same London season. She married well. I married sensibly. That's always been the crux of it. She seems to be everywhere lately, especially near people who end up frightened, missing, or visited by strange notes. Rosalind's fingers twitched against the doorknob. You think Frances is behind this? I think Frances knows more than she's let on, and I think someone has used that to their advantage. Rosalind considered her a long moment. You're not wrong. Frances has always been a collector, not of things but of people's weaknesses, secrets. She doesn't forget them. She files them away like weapons. Miss Marple stepped back. If she had something on you, Rosalind, now would be the time to share it. A pause. Rosalind's chin rose. She once hinted that she knew about the Colonel's habits. Nothing criminal, just cruel. He drank, spoke with his fists when he was frustrated. I never confirmed it, never denied it. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you. She returned home without further detour, and found an envelope had been slipped beneath her door. No name, no return address. Inside, a single page, there was a letter. She wrote it before she died. She never posted it, but I found it. You should, too, before she does. There was no signature, but the handwriting was neat and feminine. Miss Marple read the note twice. Then she reached for her old files. A letter never posted, written before death. She thought first of the Colonel, but he had died of a heart condition years ago. Then she remembered Mrs. Cartwright, the Colonel's former nurse. Quiet, devout, long retired, passed away the year after the Colonel. She had lived in a rented cottage near the post office. Her belongings had been passed on to a niece, who now lived in London. Miss Marple wrote to her that afternoon, requesting to visit. The niece, flattered and intrigued by Miss Marple's name, invited her without hesitation. 3 days later, Miss Marple returned with a small parcel wrapped in linen string. Inside were loose papers, tucked between recipe cards and household inventories. One was a letter, folded thrice, never addressed. He's not what they think. He never was. The garden is only beautiful because he buried his cruelty beneath it. She won't leave, but she's not safe. I've done what I could. The key is in the green jar. If she finds it first, burn it all. Miss Marple sat back. The green jar, not a metaphor. She remembered it clearly from the east parlour, a simple ceramic piece, tucked beside the music box. She returned to Briarwood at dusk. This time she didn't knock. The door to the east parlour creaked open with little resistance. The curtains were drawn, the fire unlit. She found the jar where, she remembered, lifted the lid and reached inside. The key was there, small, old, rusted around the edges, but intact. She tucked it into her coat just as a voice came behind her. You shouldn't be here, Jane. Miss Marple turned slowly. Lady Frances stood in the doorway. No scarf, no handbag, just her, I imagine, Miss Marple said calmly. You've come to check the jar yourself. Frances's eyes glinted in the dim light. I thought it might be too late. It is. Frances stepped forward. You don't understand. I didn't write the notes, but I knew what they meant. Rosalind never deserved peace. She buried it all, let him hurt everyone, and smiled through it. He danced Judith, even the nurse, and now she plays victim. She also lost control, Miss Marple said. That's often more terrifying than the truth. Francis didn't respond. Miss Marple held up the key. "This unlocks something, doesn't it?" Francis looked down. "There's a trunk in the gardener's shed, behind the tools." "And inside?" Francis hesitated. Everything she denied. The real Colonel Eastgate. Miss Marple nodded. "Then it's time we open it. Together." Chapter 10. The garden behind Briarwood had fallen into a hush by the time Miss Marple and Lady Frances crossed it side by side. The hedges shivered faintly in the dusk, their branches brittle with frost, while the last of the rose-hips clung stubbornly to the thorns. Nothing moved, not even the birds. The gardener's shed stood low and moss-covered at the far corner, its padlock hanging loosely, half rusted from seasons of neglect. Frances paused at the threshold, her hand hovering just above the latch. "I didn't plan it this way," she said. "I only meant to warn them. The notes, they were warnings." "And the doll?" Miss Marple asked calmly. "That was Timothy. Or so I believe. I hadn't seen it before it appeared in the pulpit. You knew about the scrapbook, the jar. You knew there were pieces Rosalind had hidden." "I knew what she was capable of hiding," Frances said flatly. The truth was always inconvenient for her. Inside, the shed smelled of earth and rusted iron. Gardening shears hung like relics on the wall, and a dusty tarpaulin covered the back half of the room. Frances pulled it away with a sharp tug. Beneath, half buried beneath flower pots and coils of twine, sat a narrow wooden trunk. Miss Marple brushed her gloves clean, then bent beside it. She fitted the key into the old brass lock. It turned with resistance, grinding, reluctant. The lid creaked as it opened. Inside, paper. Dozens of pages tied in bundles with pale green ribbon. Letters. Receipts. A torn photograph of the Colonel at a hunt. Arm around a woman who was not Rosalind. Several were medical reports. Bruising documented, signed by Nurse Cartwright. One, dated 1947, marked confidential, included witness statements. Among them, one from Judith Holtham's mother. Miss Marple lifted the top bundle and read aloud. Mrs. Eastgate was aware of the injuries. She declined intervention, claimed her husband was under stress, and that she would handle it internally. Frances closed her eyes. She protected him until the end. The notes weren't to hurt her. They were to remind her. She buried the truth with him. "And someone," Miss Marple murmured, "has now dug it up." A sudden noise behind them. A sharp crack from the garden gate. Miss Marple turned. Rosalind stood framed in the doorway, face pale as ash, eyes wide and unblinking. Her coat hung open, the hem dragging in the dirt. "How long?" she said, her voice barely audible. "Have you been watching me?" Neither woman answered. Her gaze dropped to the open trunk. "That was private. That was mine." Frances took a step forward. "So was your silence." Rosalind let out a low, bitter laugh. "You think this proves something, that I condoned it all. I survived it. That was my sin. I survived the man no one else could stand. I made the village believe everything was fine so they wouldn't turn on me next." Miss Marple studied her face. "And Timothy Vale, did he know the truth?" Rosalind hesitated. "He asked questions, too many. Found the scrapbook. I told him to leave." "You didn't threaten him?" "No. But I might have warned him not to dig deeper. I didn't want this, Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet the story continued. The notes, the disappearances. Someone else took it up after he left. Rosalind looked to Francis. You couldn't help yourself, could you? Always the performance, the righteous savior. Francis didn't flinch. Someone had to say what you wouldn't. And you think that makes you innocent? Rosalind's voice cracked now. You terrified Judith. You pushed Inez to vanish. You paraded guilt like theatre. You call that justice? No, Miss Marple said firmly. But it's not murder either. Not yet. The words hung like frost in the air. Silence. Then Rosalind stepped forward. She reached into her coat and removed a folded letter. Without a word, she handed it to Miss Marple. From Timothy Vale, the envelope read. Inside, the writing was quick, scrawled, I know now what this garden grew from. I thought I could fix it. But secrets like this, they flower in poison. I'm leaving, but not forever. When the frost breaks, I'll come back. For her sake and mine. There was no signature, just the date. 3 days before Inez disappeared. Miss Marple refolded it carefully. Why didn't you show this sooner? I was afraid, Rosalind whispered, that if he came back, he'd drag everything into the open, that the village would turn not on him, but on me. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Then it's time to decide what matters more, what you endured, or what others still believe. Rosalind looked away. That night, Miss Marple returned home with the letter, the photograph, and 3 of the green-ribboned bundles. She placed them in a box beside her chair. She did not read them again. But she knew what they contained, and she knew the next move would not be hers. It would be the murderer's. Because someone, somewhere in the village, had not just warned, or watched, or remembered. Someone had waited, and they were nearly finished waiting. Chapter 11. The next morning broke with silence. Not the usual village quiet, filled with distant bird-song and the clink of milk bottles, but an unnatural hush, like a curtain, had been drawn over Elcombe. A kind of waiting had settled in, the kind of stillness Miss Marple had learned to recognize not as peace, but as pressure. Inside her parlour, the box sat untouched beside her chair. The ribboned bundles, the letter from Timothy, the photograph, all sealed again, ready for the constable. But Miss Marple hadn't sent them yet. Something still lingered. The act behind the curtain was not yet finished. She walked to the vicarage after breakfast, where Judith Holtham answered the door with a strained smile. Inez is better, she said, quieter, but better. She keeps asking after you. I'll see her soon, Miss Marple replied. But first, I'd like to ask you something about your mother. Judith blinked. My mother? She gave a statement once about the colonel. It's in the documents Rosalind kept hidden. She told a nurse she had seen bruises on you as a child. Judith's face didn't change, but her eyes darkened slightly. She wasn't wrong, she said, though she never did much about it. She was terrified of the colonel. Everyone was. Did you ever tell anyone else? Just one person. Years later, Inez. Miss Marple nodded. Then she kept your secret, and someone used it to bait her. Judith's voice dropped. I don't understand any of this anymore. Who's behind it? Rosalind? Francis? Miss Marple shook her head slowly. Neither. Not entirely. One kept the secret. One weaponized it. But the one we've missed, the one behind the misdirection, the timing, the trap, that person is clever, observant, and subtle enough to make every warning seem like someone else's doing. She paused. Did you know someone broke into the church again last night? Judith's hand flew to her mouth. No, what happened? No vandalism, Miss Marple said. Only something added again. A single white briar laid across the altar. Freshly cut. Judith swallowed. A warning? No, Miss Marple said softly. A rehearsal. She left her then and crossed the village green. Most windows were shuttered, most curtains drawn. Fear had taken the place of gossip. And fear, in Miss Marple's experience, was an excellent mask for guilt. At the post office, Miss Grafton waved her over. You've got a letter, Miss Marple. Came by early post, no return address. Another envelope, another neatly folded page. She thinks she has survived him, but she'll meet him again beneath the arch. Alone this time. Miss Marple read it twice. Her breath, when it left her, came, not in fear, but quiet certainty. It would happen tonight. She walked the long way home, turning it all over in her mind. The notes, the doll, the glove, the cup, the music box, the locked room. Each piece had been meant to unnerve, not just to frighten, but to guide, to corral Rosalind Eastgate into isolation, memory, and guilt. And now, back to the garden, to the thorned briar arch, the final trap. Miss Marple returned home, folded the new note into her pocket, and placed a call to the constable. Be near Briarwood this evening, she said simply. Come quietly, and bring someone you trust. That evening she brewed tea but did not drink it. She sat near the window, her knitting untouched, her shawl wrapped tighter than usual. At 10 minutes to 9, she left her cottage. The sky was dark, the wind had dropped, and the world seemed to breathe only in whispers. She walked slowly to Briarwood, past the iron gate, past the wilting rosebeds, past the shed with its secrets unearthed, and there it stood, the arch, framed in moonlight, and beneath it, Rosalind, alone. Her hands were folded before her. Her breath hung in the air. Her posture was still but tense, like she was waiting for a verdict she already suspected would be grim. I received a note, she said, not turning. I know, Miss Marple replied. I thought it would be him, Timothy, that he had come back. Miss Marple stepped beside her. It wasn't him. Rosalind turned her head. Her expression wasn't fear. It was weariness. I thought if I stood here long enough, I might understand it all. Why someone would go to such lengths just to ruin me. I kept the truth buried, but I didn't cause it. No, Miss Marple agreed. But someone believes that letting evil fester is the same as growing it. A twig snapped. Both women turned. From the shadows behind the garden wall, a figure emerged. Not Timothy Vale, not Francis, Judith Holtham. Her coat was open, her hair pulled back, her face pale with something cold and unreadable. I thought it would be just her, Judith said quietly. I thought I could say it, finally, here where it happened. Rosalind took a step back. Judith! Judith looked only at Miss Marple. You knew, didn't you? I suspected, Miss Marple said gently. When Inez vanished, I suspected. When the term bramble bride was used, but it wasn't until the second break-in at the church that I was sure. Judith's voice cracked. I couldn't let it go. Not after seeing that scrapbook. Not after remembering everything. You know what he did to us. Me, my mother, Inez. And she knew it all along. She did, Miss Marple said. But you didn't want her arrested. You wanted her to suffer, the way you did. Judith stepped forward, one hand trembling. I didn't poison anyone. I didn't kill. I just made sure she remembered. The constable stepped from the hedge then, along with another officer. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Judith looked up at the arch once more. I never meant to become like him. You didn't, Miss Marple said softly. But you stood too long beneath the thorns. Chapter 12. The constable took Judith Holton away just before midnight. There were no handcuffs, no raised voices, just the sound of frost cracking beneath shoes and the quiet rustle of a coat pulled tighter against the night. Judith didn't resist. She didn't even look back. Rosalind stood beneath the briar arch long after the others had gone. Her breath still misted in the cold. Her hands, clasped in front of her, had not moved. Miss Marple remained beside her, silent. It was some time before Rosalind spoke. She was the one slipping the notes. Yes, and the doll. I believe Timothy Vale left that, Miss Marple said gently. To draw attention, perhaps to frighten you into remembering, perhaps to frighten himself into leaving. Rosalind's mouth pulled into something close to a grim smile. Then I suppose I frightened everyone, except the one person who most needed it. You frightened yourself, Miss Marple said quietly. And that is what made you human. Rosalind shook her head. I thought silence was strength, that if I buried it, it wouldn't shape me. But it did. It shaped Judith too. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. Trauma always grows, especially in soil kept too tidy. They parted at the gate, Rosalind retreating to the house, Miss Marple to the empty lane. The sky above Elcombe shimmered faintly with starlight, and a faint wind stirred the dry leaves, still clinging to the thorned arch. By morning, the village had begun to breathe again. It didn't happen all at once, but by noon the post office bell rang again. Mrs. Pettinell's bakery opened, though her buns came out half-burnt. The vicar's sermon draft lay unfinished, but he sat with Inez Clearwater for nearly an hour over tea. Whispers continued, but they were different now. Less about fear, more about sorrow, as if the entire village had realized something terrible had passed through them without ever fully naming itself. Judith's arrest was not the talk of scandal. It was the talk of grief. At the vicarage, Miss Marple sat with Inez and the Reverend Holtham over tea. Judith's absence hovered like a missing chair, but no one tried to fill it. She didn't hurt me, Inez said softly. Not really. She just warned me, over and over, until I stopped hearing it. She didn't want to hurt anyone, Holtham said, only to remind us of what we'd forgotten. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Judith didn't want revenge. She wanted recognition, and she wanted Rosalind to remember, not just what happened, but what it cost. And now? Inez asked. Now, Miss Marple said, the truth has been told, and like all truths, it will settle slowly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned home to find a letter waiting in her postbox, handwritten, no return address. But this time she recognized the slanted, meticulous hand. "Miss Marple, you were right. I did dig too deep. I was reckless with what I uncovered and cowardly in what I failed to say aloud. I believed unearthing Rosalind's secrets would solve everything. But instead, I pushed Judith to do what I never had the nerve to finish. I am leaving England. I've no wish to return. Not now. Not with what's unfolded. I leave behind only this. Inez never deserved the fear I placed in her path. Please tell her I'm sorry. Please tell her I'm sorry. Yours sincerely, Timothy Vale." Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in the small wooden box she kept for memories that still stung. Then she rose and went to her garden. The frost had spared some of the late lavender. The roses were long gone, but the briars still clung to the back wall, twisted, tangled, and thorned. She considered pruning them just a little. Instead, she left them be. Some truths, she thought, were better remembered than removed. That evening, she penned her final entry in the little notebook she'd carried since Rosalind's tea party. Final reasoning. Miss Marple's notes. Motive. Judith Hultham was a survivor of the Colonel's abuse, as were others. She witnessed her mother's silence, Rosalind's complicity, and her own trauma buried beneath civility. With Timothy Vale's arrival and discovery of the scrapbook, the past resurfaced. Means Judith had access to the church, the vicarage, and social circles. Her placement of notes, the glove, and the final invitation beneath the Briar arch were precise. Not to kill, but to provoke. She wanted to awaken guilt in Rosalind, not to end her life. Opportunity. Judith's role as the vicar's wife gave her both trust and freedom. She used symbolic gestures, briars, music, phrases like Bramble Bride, to evoke memory and legend, crafting a psychological trap Rosalind would walk into herself. Red herrings. Lady Frances, dramatic and meddling, misdirected suspicion. Timothy Vale, by vanishing, became a ghost for others to blame, but neither had motive deep enough for the orchestration. Resolution. Judith's breakdown beneath the briar was not a confession of violence, but of burden. The weight of buried history had become too much to carry. Miss Marple closed the notebook. Another case ended, but not cleanly, not triumphantly, just truthfully. And in Elcombe, as in most places, that was as much as anyone could hope for. Chapter 13. December came early that year. By the first week, the fields around Elcombe were already rimmed with frost, and the stream near the churchyard had begun to harden at the edges. The sky remained pale and brittle, and the sound of birdsong had grown distant, occasional, hesitant. But something else had changed, too. A stillness remained over the village, not the fearful quiet of a threatened place, but the subdued hush that comes after a long illness has finally broken. People moved a little more slowly, spoke more softly, made more room in their silences for others to speak, if they wished. Miss Marple felt it in the postmistress's pause before a greeting, in the way Mrs. Pettingill handed over a loaf of bread with both hands now, not distractedly but carefully, like it mattered. Judith Hultham was no longer in the vicarage. Her husband, Reverend Hultham, had arranged for her to be taken quietly to a convalescent home on the coast. not far from where her mother had once lived. He had given no sermon the following Sunday, only read a passage on mercy, then sat down, with his head bowed. No one had whispered afterward. Not even Lady Frances Timothy Vale was not seen again. His absence this time held no mystery, just a shadow of regret in Inez Clearwater's eyes whenever his name came up. She had returned to teaching, cautiously. Her students noticed she played slower now, but they didn't mind. Rosalind Eastgate remained in Briarwood, though she no longer hosted garden teas or accepted invitations to lunches. Instead, she was often seen tending the roses in silence, pruning the dead branches gently, as though afraid of doing more damage. She never removed the arch. It remained, twined with thorns and silence, a quiet gate between the present and everything that had once festered beneath the soil. Miss Marple visited her only once, on a still December morning when the frost lay thick across the lawn. Rosalind met her with a nod and a kettle already warming on the stove. "I never thought I'd be left behind," she said, handing over the cups. Miss Marple didn't reply at first. She stirred her tea, then let it settle. "Left behind or left to reckon?" she asked softly. Rosalind gave a short laugh. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The first is abandonment, the second is consequence." Rosalind stared into her tea. "I suppose I deserved that." "You deserved truth," Miss Marple corrected gently. "And now you have it. Others paid for your silence, yes, but you pay now too, quietly, daily." Rosalind nodded once, then said, almost as an afterthought, "I've taken down the scrapbook." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Good. Let the thorns live in memory, not in albums." When she returned home later that day, the fire had gone out, but the kettle was still warm. She settled in her chair, reached for her knitting, and found herself turning instead to the small wooden box where she kept old letters, clippings, fragments of puzzles once solved. She opened it, briefly, then closed it again. There was no need to revisit the scrapbook's contents, no further dots to connect, no final twist waiting in the shadows. Everything had already been revealed, not just to the village, but to those who had spent years avoiding the mirror. Miss Marple looked to the window, where the frost had begun to trace spider-leg patterns across the glass. Beyond it, the trees stood bare and waiting, and the roofs of Elcombe steamed gently beneath the rising sun. The village would heal. It always did, but something else had taken root now. An understanding, perhaps, that no place was truly safe from the things it buried. As Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more, a soft knock came at the door. When she opened it, she found a small paper package tied with string and no sender's name. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a pressed sprig of white briar, and a note in familiar slanted handwriting, "Miss Marple, for remembrance and for closure. Thank you for listening to what wasn't said." J.H. Miss Marple read it twice, then set it on the mantel beside a jar of lavender sprigs. No police report had ever been filed against Judith Holtham. No charge had been made, because in the end there had been no death. Only warnings, only truth. And sometimes truth left a deeper wound than any knife could manage. The village never spoke of it openly again. But every year, when the first frost came, and the roses died back beneath the brambles. Someone, no one knew who, laid a single white bloom beneath the thorned arch at Briarwood. No card, no message, just memory, and Miss Marple, from her parlor window, always saw it, always understood that beneath every garden, no matter how lovely, something must decay in order for anything else to grow.